Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Roar Lions Roar. I am your fill-in host or host for this evening, or I'm not sure how we're doing this because we're kind of trading off as we go here. Regardless, I am Matt DeBear. I am joined tonight by my pal Matt Flipovitz over in Chicago. How are you doing this evening, Matt?
Matt, I'm good. I was on the south side of Chicago today, and I decided to walk back along the lakefront because I didn't want to. It was a nice day. I didn't want to take the train, and I knew the Bears were home, so I wanted to see what the tailgate scene was like. So I walked about like 4.5 miles of lakeshore real estate, and I had a lot of time just to ponder the Penn State Central Michigan game that I just watched, and I think I'm ready to fully dive into this Chippewa matchup.
Well, that is a perfect segue. As everyone listening is aware, Penn State moved to 4-0 on Saturday after knocking off the Central Michigan Chippewas 33-14. We'll get into some of the details of the game here in a little bit, but it was a uneven matchup, we'll call it to start. Team really came out on fire, went up 14-0 very quickly on the back of some beneficial field position and a hot start for Sean Clifford. Clifford finished with 217 yards and three passing touchdowns. He also ran for one on a quarterback sneak. Um, Katron Allen was kind of the story of the game on offense, though, for Penn State, cracking 100 yards for the first time, which I believe is the third straight game Penn State has had a 100-yard rusher, which the last time that happened, we probably have to go back to Booby Sanders or Journey Brown, I would imagine. So it has been a couple years since we've
Yeah.
had that. Um, but like I said, it was a little bit of an uneven performance. Going up 14 nothing. They were able to get to the locker room at 21-14, but Central Michigan scored 14 unanswered as Penn State kind of sputtered on offense and couldn't really slow down the Chippewa passing attack with some impressive catches that we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, here. Carlos Correa had 11 catches for 111 yards for Central Michigan. Joel Wilson, who I believe is their tight end, had a solid game with 5 catches and 59 yards. Um, but I guess, let's get into the game a little bit here. This might be the shorter of the two answers, but what went right for Penn State on Saturday, Matt?
I think it starts with it was a sleepy game. It's a nooner coming off of maybe the most impressive road win of the Franklin era. So they looked sleepy. I think everything about the game just screamed not even looking ahead, because you're not really looking ahead at this point to that stretch in October, because you have, of course, that Northwestern game and then the bye. But it just looked like that they were not like taking their foot off the gas. It just looked like they didn't have their A game, and I get it. They've had to bring their A game two of the first three games of the year, which is not something a lot of teams get to say. So, in terms of things that actually went right, I would have to say it's Katron Allen's emergence. I loved the fact that it's game four, and we've already seen Penn State break 100 yards with two different backs. Like the three straight games thing is great. We were hoping we would have that at least two against the MAC foes, but now to have it done with two separate players, I think sets the team up for success. I really liked the amount of rotation we saw. I think I have the numbers pulled up here, and they didn't rotate really late. They rotated early. They rotated a ton of guys. JB Nelson got a ton of reps early on when the offense was kind of sputtering in that window you mentioned where the Chippewas scored 14 straight. But in the end, 7 linemen played, 14 defensive linemen played, 10 linebackers, 13 DBs. And those are the positions that probably rotate the most. So to see a lot of guys go out there and make impact plays, I'm talking Zakee Wheatley, denied Dennis Sutton. We finally got to see a package where Abdul Carter and Curtis Jacobs were on the field at the same time. So in terms of actual highlight real things we're going to think about during the bye week when we're bored, it wasn't much, but it was all of these secondary pieces. And I don't mean like defensive backs, like second pieces more on the back burner than they are superstars, were the ones going out there and making plays and becoming the storyline. So I think that was only a net positive for the team.
Then I think to go along with that, the opportunity to get a lot of guys that probably, even guys that are probably going to redshirt this year, or guys that are further on the depth chart, like you said, got into the game early. And I think that speaks a lot to what the coaching staff's plan for the game was going in.
Yep.
It's a weird point in the schedule here, like you alluded to, Matt. We had Purdue, then the OU game, and then Auburn. So they start the season right out with a big game, conference game on the road. They get the win, and then even though Ohio's a game that on paper they were going to walk through regardless, they're building towards Auburn. They're building towards kind of the highlight of the non-conference schedule. Then you get through that, you're 3-0, you're relatively healthy, and now you've got Central Michigan, a bad Northwestern team that we'll talk about in a little bit and later this week, previewing that game.
Oh my God. I cannot believe how bad Northwestern
How bad
is.
do you think Scott Frost feels about how bad Northwestern is?
I mean, Scott Frost kind of wins in the end because he gets that extra $7.5 million from losing anyway by not waiting those 3 weeks. So Scott Frost is living the good life so far.
But so you have these two kind of walkthrough games. Yes, Northwestern's a Big Ten game, but it's at home. It's a team that is quite frankly not very good. And then you've got the bye week.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got Michigan. And that's the start of this brutal stretch that we're going to talk about here in a little bit later on this afternoon or this evening. And so you have this weird opportunity in a game where, unless things go really, really backwards, you're going to win the game. The game, even when it was 14-14, it was never really in doubt. I think we all kind of assumed that the superior talent was going to take over, and it did eventually. And it was sloppy. But I think between this weird point in the schedule allowed them to be able to do some things. And James Franklin's talked a lot about this. He kind of discussed it a little bit when he was asked about the redshirt situation, having this opportunity to get guys into games that are probably still going to redshirt, guys that really haven't played a whole lot. We saw Liam Clifford catch 2 passes on Saturday. Robbie Dwyer got an interception late in the game that got negated by, I think it was a too many men on the field penalty.
Yeah.
Dom DeLuca played more than he's played. I know he's more of a higher up the depth chart guy, but he played an awful lot. You alluded to the number of guys that rotated through different spots, and they were doing that early, and I think that speaks to how they kind of approached this game. And so even though the end result isn't probably what a lot of us expected, I know it's not what you expected, Matt, based on what you said last week during the preview podcast with, I think you went with Craig. But it's a win on a weekend where a lot of teams struggled. Kentucky snuck by Northern Illinois. Georgia kind of slept walk against Kent State. There were a couple other games where more highly regarded teams just kind of slept walk through the game. I think that's really where Penn State was.
Yeah.
But with that said, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, and you have, I know, some thoughts on this especially. What went wrong? And I think to kind of go along with that, what are some red flags that might be coming up that you might want to worry about going into the heart of the schedule here?
Yeah, I'll kind of split this up into 2 parts in the what went wrong purely on this weekend's game, and it's the kicking game. Kicking game is capital B bad right now. Sandor Sahadak, I know, his 57-yarder, which would tie a school record, but he shanked it. It wasn't even remotely close. Pinniger, short field goal. We thought maybe he turned a corner against Auburn. He missed it bad again this week. Franklin said in his post-game press conference, kickoffs aren't where they want to be, and I made a point of that I'm not sure if they're trying not to have touchbacks anymore because the coverage has been really good, but all it's going to take is one big playmaker going out there and making that difference. And all of a sudden, things look a lot different on that front. So I'm a little worried on that front. Just some things that, again, can bite Penn State in the butt. Special teams is a boring thing to talk about, but I always go back to the biggest play of the Franklin era was a special teams play. So it has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed rather quickly. And then I was talking to, I think it was actually all 5 of us in our Slack channel today about if we think back to Villanova last year, it was a gross game, and we kind of just said Penn State slept walk through it, and any errors that happened in that game we chalked up to that. And I was looking for things in this game that would be red flags that I have right now, and it's still the offensive line for me. I still don't think they've found their best mix of 5. I think they're getting closer, but I'm all for getting guys reps, but we've really only seen one dominant performance so far, and that's been against granted, a very talented SEC West opponent in Auburn, but in order for us to say that offensive line has taken that step, they've got to start stacking dominant games on dominant games, and that's not what this was. So I'm a bit worried on that front. And then I don't love that Singleton got bottled up, but I do like that they were able to adjust the plan a little bit and Katron Allen then became the star because they're both really talented, but both do different things really well. So there's definitely things that I'm a bit concerned about. And I think if we didn't see what happened in 2021 happen, I would probably, be in that same boat of just chalking it up to it being a sleepy game. But again, we saw errors in Villanova last year that came back and reared their ugly heads later in the schedule. So I think the staff has to understand that they have to be playing near perfect football against these kind of foes to really make people think they've turned the corner.
Yeah, and I think, full disclosure, I did not see the Villanova game last year. I was on a golf trip with some family and friends.
Oh, it was gross.
But I pulled up the stats while you were talking because I remember watching highlights of it. And I remember kind of following on my phone, that sort of thing. But I think two things that are, I guess, one key thing that is, I think, a positive or an improvement on that game is Penn State was able to run the ball on Saturday against Central. They found, it wasn't maybe what we expected as far as Nicholas Singleton, I think is actually what he prefers, or as my wife affectionately calls him, Nicky Singles. But he was, there were a couple of circumstances, a couple of specific plays where I thought he probably had, maybe 4 or 5 yards, maybe a little bit more. There was a hole there, but I think, and Matt Millen in a very backwards way kind of alluded to this on the broadcast, he's wired to break the big play, and we've seen it a handful of times now through 4 games. But I think some circumstances, a couple plays where he had the ability to get the 4 or 5 yards, and instead tried to go for 40 or 50. I think that might have clouded a little bit of the offensive line performance because the holes were there. There were opportunities to gain positive yards. And I think to go along with that, I think it also led to some situations where they ended up behind the change or behind schedule on first and second downs. So I think that ability to throw change it up, go with Katron Allen, and a guy that is probably a little bit more a one-cut kind of guy, sees the hole, finds it. And we saw it on Saturday. Still has the ability to break the big run. But I think having two guys that kind of...
It's a bummer that toss counter they ran, which they got a ton of yards on against Auburn, it worked again. It got negated for holding, but that was like the perfect example of him putting his foot in the ground and just going. That was awesome.
And to go along with that, I think they called that same play with Singleton earlier in the game, and there was a modest gain that he had there, but he went for the big play, which again, that's kind of what he is, and he'll learn, he'll continue to improve. But I think having that ability to make that change on the fly to a guy that can adjust better to what Central Michigan was trying to do, stacking the box, cover zero. We heard a lot about that. But my concern is, and I think the red flag from this is, on offense at least, when you are presented with that opportunity, it's basically a team daring you to beat you with their arm. And Penn State wasn't able to consistently do that. I think Sean Clifford missed throws. I think receivers dropped passes. I think there were circumstances where receivers just didn't get open. It was a weird game, and I think going up 14-0 like they did so quickly in a game where, as much as you can talk about it as a coaching staff and all week, every game matters. Go 1-0. This is the most important game on the schedule. These are college kids. They know who they're playing. They're coming off the high of a win at Auburn. There's going to be that inevitable letdown. You're not going to have that same level of energy every week. And when you factor that into the psychological part of it too, against the name that you see on the schedule, and then you go up 14-0 super early, combined with all the rotation that was going on, it's not hard to see where things got off track a little bit. But I think it's the same thing we've seen from the passing game really for a couple of years now. When teams are daring you to run the ball, you have to be able to throw it with some level of consistency down the field to either make teams pay or back them off to open up the run. And I think Penn State was able to, from a physical standpoint, take control of the game enough to let Katron Allen kind of run through what Central Michigan was presenting, but Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio State, these teams coming up next month, they're going to be able to run that same kind of defense and be more of a physical equal to what Penn State can put out there, where that passing game is going to have to improve. And I think it can. We've seen it in spurts. You know, it hasn't been consistent. And I think we even saw it from when Drew Aller came in. And again, it was kind of a hodgepodge mix of personnel out there. But this is probably the most that we've seen him struggle in his short tenure too. Missed throws. That throw to Liam Clifford though was unbelievable. But kind of.
What a great grab by him too.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think it's just this unevenness, and the concern is it's been an issue for a couple of years now. I think this team feels different through 4 games. I think going back in hindsight now to last year, and Penn State's 5-0 going to Iowa, top 5 in the country. There were bigger red flags. They couldn't run the ball. They hadn't run the ball in a single game up to that point. They were getting by with Sean Clifford's big game against Auburn. A truly spectacular defensive performance at Wisconsin Open last season. But those red flags, I think, were a lot redder to be perfectly obvious. And this team, like I said, it feels different. Not to say they're going to go out and they're going to go 12-0 and we're going to be talking about Big Ten championships and playoffs. But I think they are better suited both from a personnel standpoint with Singleton and Allen, but also I think just kind of a mindset. I think they're just the way the players talk, the way the coaches talk. I think there's more of an understanding of, it's great to be 4-0, and we've done a lot of things really well. But I think the things that need to be cleaned up are things that are able to be cleaned up to some degree, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. In terms of things I'm not as worried about anymore, I think it's got to be this secondary. This secondary all across safety, corners, I think it's the best in the Big Ten. Joey Porter Jr., teams aren't throwing at him anymore. Like nobody's trying it. I haven't seen, granted, Ohio, Auburn can't throw Central Michigan. But Central Michigan went after Kalen King, and he delivered. I think it was PFF, which is far from perfect, don't get me wrong, graded Kalen King as the highest graded defender in college football on Saturday. And then you add in a guy like Johnny Dixon, who just has this, I guess we want to call it at this point, Wheatley-esque knack for making big plays. Like he had a pick again this past weekend. So
and a great play too. It was
on a great play.
Great coverage, and he went up and made the play.
These safeties, Wheatley with another pick, Jair Brown always does his thing. Jalen Reed, Keaton Ellis, like these are just dudes who are finding ways to shut down passing attacks. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but let's be honest, the Michigan and the Minnesota offenses are going to try to run the football down Penn State's throat, and that's still a bit of a concern. But against that Ohio State receiving core, I think that matchup's a lot more, I don't want to say evenly matched, but it's a lot closer than I think we realized heading into the season. So there's definitely some good you can take away. And I like that through every week so far, there's been a different player of the game, let's call it. I think Purdue, I know he threw the pick. You got to give it to Sean Clifford. Against Ohio, it's probably Singleton. You think that's
Absolutely,
fair to say?
Yeah.
In Auburn, I think it's Jair Brown. I thought he played the best. And then in this one, it was Katron Allen. So I think it's really cool that we're not seeing this be like how it was for a long time, where it was Saquon's the one who's going to make a big play. Jahan's the one who's going to make a big play. Brandon Bell's the one who's going to make a big play defensively. It seems like it's just changing so much now. So definitely something I like going forward. And I think this depth they're building is only going to help them as we get into the heart of the Big Ten schedule now.
Well, I think too, to go along with that, just the turnovers in general. I don't know where they rank nationally. I know USC's number 1 at like plus 14 or something insane like that. They've yet to turn the ball over themselves. But it's 4 more turnovers on Saturday against Central. They had 3 or 4, I believe, against Auburn.
4 against Auburn.
So they're, like we talked about going into the year with Manny Diaz, and I know I saw someone earlier today refer to, they're still kind of doing this bend don't break deal, but I think they're avoiding the breaking, if you will, in a different way. They're doing it by creating these negative plays.
It also doesn't feel like the Brent Pry thing. Like, it doesn't feel like the plan isn't, let them settle for a field goal. It feels like the plan when the teams get in the red zone is to turn them over.
For sure, and it led to points. Central scored 14 points, and they were able to move the ball with some level of consistency. I think they ran a lot of what, for the sake of easy comparison, what Purdue tried to do. You get the ball out quickly, and that wasn't the case consistently. But I think there was a conscious effort on Central's part to try to mitigate Penn State's pass rush by getting the ball out with some level of quickness. We saw later in the game with their backup quarterback that came in, was holding onto the ball a little bit longer, and the rush was able to get home. That's where we saw Dennis Sutton get a couple of sacks.
Yep.
But even on plays where they weren't able to get to the quarterback, the first interception they forced the bad throw. I can't remember who it was. Got a hand on the Central quarterback's shoulder and forced that duck that Zakee Wheatley picked off.
Yep.
And
great play by him. He's loving that center field.
Absolutely, yeah.
He plays that so.
So well. I think on the defensive side of the ball, they're doing a lot of what we talked about, a lot of what Manny Diaz wants. They're creating these chaos plays. They're forcing turnovers, and they're taking advantage of them. Taking advantage of the opportunities that they're creating. Offensively, they're taking care of the ball, and I know sometimes that's boring, but
boring's good.
You can win a lot of games by being boring. There's a coach at Penn State that won a lot of games for over a lot of years by being kind of boring. But if you take care of the ball, you force turnovers, and you take advantage of the other team's mistakes and limit your own, that's good. That's a winning recipe a lot of the time, especially when you're a team like Penn State that has the level of talent that they do. Before we kind
of real quick, Matt, before I forget, so I have it pulled up here. Turnover margin in FBS football. Penn State currently ranks 4th, and they are only one of 2 teams in the top 10 in the Power 5. The other, of course, being Southern Cal with a turnover margin of 14. Penn State sits at 8th. I'm sorry, with 8 for 4th nationally.
I think that's really. We have to go back and look and see what they were the last few years, but I think that's a difference. I think. And it's not just that they're getting the turnovers. Like I said, it's how they're getting them. The fumble was Kalen King was able to get his hand in there and strip the ball out. The first interception was getting to the quarterback, forcing a bad throw, and then making the play. Johnny Dixon wasn't so much forcing a bad throw, but he made great coverage and went up and made the play. You're seeing more and more that. You're seeing more and more passes defended, which I know if you talk to Bill Conley, the more passes you defend, the more likely you are to eventually get that interception, that turnover. Before we move on to something I want to talk about next, I want to also talk about they're all in the laundry, but our pals at Home Field, who you've heard us talk about before, I just got done moving. If you look behind me, you will see boxes that have yet to be unpacked. But the 3 days last weekend that we were moving into our new house, it was a new Home Field shirt every day. Super comfortable to be moving, heavy lifting, if you will. But like I said, our pals use code ROARLINESROAR for 15% off your first order. I would be wearing one right now, but I have yet to do laundry. We are still in the process of unpacking. I know, Matt, you've got several more. My wife just ordered, I think we got like 4 or 5 more coming, this week or next, depending on when they get sent out. So great shirts.
I saw a couple people at the bar I was at watching the game in some Home Field gear, which was always exciting. I was chatting with a couple of them just about the drop, and they said they saw a lot of Home Field Penn State gear down at the Auburn game. So that was cool. It was cool to chop it up with some fellow Home Field fans and some fellow Penn State alums.
Yeah, we have obviously I've got I think 4 or 5 Penn State shirts. I got another one in the order we placed yesterday. But I think what's cool too is I live in Michigan, and obviously Michigan State. You're not going to catch me wearing anything like that. But you've got Northern Michigan up in the UP, cool school, up in Marquette, Michigan. So I got a shirt from them. Wayne State, which is a school in downtown Detroit. Really cool urban campus. I think they play Division III, whatever that's called. Got a shirt for them. So if you are fans of small local schools, they've got that. I got a Hawaii shirt because we visited Hawaii last summer, and Hawaii is gorgeous, and so
Nice.
that just felt like a natural. So again, use code RoarLionsRoar, 15% off your first order, and thanks to them for continuing to allow us to talk at you about Penn State football. Getting back to Penn State football, the non-conference schedule's over. Believe it or not, we are into Big Ten play for the rest of the season, starting with Northwestern on Saturday. Kind of a weird non-conference schedule, I guess, when you start with Purdue, a Big Ten game to open the season.
Yeah.
And we did the same thing a year ago, and you think we'd be used to it now. But once again, 3-0, I think, like we were just saying, probably more impressive this year through the non-conference schedule than they certainly were a year ago. So I want to ask you, Matt, what do we know about Penn State now that we didn't know at this time a month ago going into the season?
They're a contender in the Big Ten. I think that's up front first and foremost. I think we have to start talking about this Penn State team as a contender. I am still not sold on Michigan. Minnesota, I think, is much better than a lot of us thought, but no disrespect to Michigan State, but Minnesota hasn't played anybody. Michigan State is capital B bad this year. Mel Tucker, good for you for getting the bag, and I hope you last as long as possible. And if you don't, you're going to enjoy that buyout money. But I think it's time that we have to acknowledge that this Penn State team is a realistic fringe Big Ten title team. Because again, there's always the Ohio State in the room. And I think another thing we have to acknowledge is that it doesn't really matter if they're thin at linebacker anymore, because Abdul Carter is here, and he is the kind of player who can erase basically all of my depth concerns. Granted, if he gets hurt, then the depth concern comes right back, but I'm not worried about any unit on this defense anymore. I think there's still some issues giving up big plays, especially against the run, which we've seen for a long time. But again, I'm not really all that concerned about that front seven anymore. And, I just sang the praises of this secondary. So I think it's realistic this Penn State team could maybe lead the Big Ten in turnovers gained. I mean, they're already at +4 or +8 just in the last 2 games. So I think there's still a lot we have to learn, but I think we can only be looking at things more positively after what we've seen so far throughout these first 4 games.
Yeah, and I think to go along with that, on the defensive side at least, we know that the personnel that Penn State has can play Manny Diaz's defense. There's still kinks to work out. There's going to be probably for the rest of the year, we're going to see, especially from veteran guys that have played 3-4 years in a different system. They're old habits die hard, right? So, but I think we've seen them defensively do a lot of what we talked about, like I was saying earlier. They've created those turnovers. They've gotten to the quarterback. I know Auburn has its warts and is going to be lucky to get to 500 this year, and Brian Harsin is probably going to be very fortunate if he still has a job by the end of October based on what Auburn has coming up. But I think we saw against an overmatched offensive line, Penn State just was relentless in getting to the Auburn quarterbacks, and they really were able to shut down the running game with with pretty significant success. It wasn't 100%. Tank, the Auburn running game is certainly talented with their 3 backs that they can roll out there, but they were able to do what Manny Diaz preaches: get to the quarterback. I think we saw some of that against Ohio, Purdue, and Central, like we talked about, kind of a little different passing game. I think the other thing, and this is by no means to say that they are there, but the offensive line, I think, is much improved. There's a lot to go because they started so far down, but
yeah, there's a long way to go.
But like we were saying earlier, they rushed for, I think it was 80 yards against Villanova last year. They rushed for, let me pull it up here real quick, 166 yards. Not elite by any means, but they averaged over 5 yards a carry. I think they are generally doing a better job protecting the quarterbacks. Um, we're going to learn a lot more about them here in a few weeks, starting with this 3-game stretch at Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio State. But I think credit where credit is due, they have taken a step forward that was sorely needed, and I think we've seen this offense kind
Yep.
of evolve from there. We're 4 games into the season, but I think there's still some things that we need to learn about this team too.
Yep.
We need to see them do it again, quite frankly, against a higher quality opponent. I think Purdue has their own issues with Aiden O'Connell's injury.
I still think Purdue is the second best team in the West.
I would agree with that. And I think if O'Connell's healthy,
yeah,
that Syracuse game was just weird. They've lost a couple
Yeah.
games, the Penn State game, now the Syracuse game, where they've played pretty well. And I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot against Syracuse. I think Penn State kind of took it from them, if I'm being honest. But I think we've got, the non-conference schedule's over, but the preseason I think kind of ends after Saturday, after the Northwestern game. You go to Michigan, who we're going to talk about here in a minute. I think we learned a little bit about them finally playing a team like with a pulse on Saturday. Minnesota is a top 10 team in S&P Plus now. I think they're actually ranked ahead of Penn State by a couple slots on Bill Connelly's rankings. And then obviously you host Ohio State on Halloween weekend. That's really the season right there when you're talking about Big Ten championships, college football playoffs, New Year's Six bids, that sort of thing. I think we need to see how this offensive line, for example, holds up against higher quality opposition. I think we need to see how these 2 running backs that have been, everything that was advertised through 4 games. Let's see them against this better competition. I really think that's the big question that's out there. Is Penn State's answered a lot of things, and I think is in a much better spot after 4 games than they were a year ago, even though the record's the same. And they were ranked higher a year ago. But I think because of some of these new guys, these new systems, let's see what they do when they're pushed a little bit more. And I think having gone through the Purdue game, winning it the way they did, going to a place like Jordan-Hare, I think that those are going to be benefits that they probably didn't have a year ago when they faced some adversity during the heart of the Big Ten schedule. But they have to face that adversity, I think, against a team like Michigan or Minnesota or Ohio State, or even Maryland, who I think has been, maybe say deserved a better fate against Michigan over the weekend.
Yeah, I would say so. One quick point I just want to make sure I get in before I know we're shifting to a little bit more, broader Big Ten conversation. I still don't know if Sean Clifford and I'm the guy who thinks they should start Drew Aller. I'm not going to change my take on this. I mean, I'm sorry. I know people don't love that take, especially people we talk to, but I'm not changing it because he's 24 years old. It's year 6. I don't know if he's a game manager or a game elevator still for the 2022 Penn State football team. And I still think we cannot learn that until Michigan. And I think Michigan is gettable, and I am afraid that we will learn that lesson in the wrong direction again. I think in the past he's been a more game manager than game elevator, and it didn't work out in Penn State's favor. And I don't know if 2022 Sean Clifford is game manager or game elevator yet.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we don't need to get into the whole quarterback debate again. But
that's a bye week conversation.
I'm going to schedule a vacation that week. Then I think you and I have discussed that one offline enough. But I think that's certainly a fair question. Penn State's, I alluded to it earlier, Penn State's passing game, I don't think, especially, and this isn't just a Sean Clifford thing. I think this is a wide receiver thing too. They haven't shown a level of consistency through 4 games that I think makes you feel better about punishing a team that runs a defense like Central Michigan ran on Saturday. Not, Ohio State, Michigan, Minnesota, whoever. I think a lot of times as fans, we get fooled into thinking, oh, Team A saw this work against Team B, so they're going to try and do the same thing. Teams have their own systems. They're going to try and do, just for the sake of argument, Michigan's going to try and do what Central Michigan did defensively within what their system is. Ohio State, the same thing. defensive coordinators aren't going to change their stripes just because, this is what they do. This is what someone else did that was really effective against them. But it still lays out a blueprint, and I think as great as Parker Washington is, as great as Mitchell Tinsley is, I think they, for a variety of reasons, aren't. We saw this weekend, we saw them struggle a little bit with press coverage and being able to create the separation when they're in those man-on-man situations. Penn State doesn't have a third receiver. Trey Wallace had the opportunity on Saturday, had a key drop on, I think it was a third down play, second or third down, but it would have converted for a first down. Keandre Lambert-Smith has been inconsistent. Didn't really see a whole lot of him on Saturday. No one has really stepped up to take over that third receiver spot. Brenton Strange has, I think, been a revelation in a positive way.
Yeah, I did not see that coming at all.
But he's not a Mike Gesicki or a Pat Fryermuth type tight end that's going to stretch the field. He's a great tight end. I think he might be a more complete tight end in some ways than both those guys. But I think can someone like Theo Johnson, now that he's healthy, he made a nice catch on Saturday. I think it converted for a first down as well. Can he emerge as a guy that can become that third, or I guess if you're counting Brenton Strange, that fourth receiving threat, but someone that can stretch the field a little bit more? They don't have that big play threat at receiver that they've had the last couple of years with Jahan Dotson, before that KJ Hamler, and going back before that, Chris Godwin, Deshaun Hamilton. They don't have that one guy that you feel like you can kind of go to when you need that big play in the passing game. Mm-hmm. And it's gonna be a need at some point. And I think that's you've got 2 weeks to kind of figure that out, I think, because we're getting into the Big Ten schedule, like we've talked about a little bit. I'm going to change up our schedule or our itinerary here a little bit because I put these out of order of who Penn State plays. But Penn State's next game that I think is of consequence, no offense to Northwestern, but like we said earlier, they are. If Michigan State is capital B,
they're real bad,
then I'm not sure what Northwestern is. They fell to Miami of Ohio on Saturday, a week after. I can't remember who beat them then, but
the Salukis, come on, don't disrespect Southern Illinois like
that. I couldn't remember what direction it was, to be perfectly honest with you. But Penn State goes to the Big House in little less than 3 weeks. Michigan.
Are you going?
I am. Yes, I actually a work colleague of mine got me 4 tickets, and then it surprised me when he mailed them to me with a parking pass, which Penn State fans can empathize with. Having a parking spot in advance is massive. So I have a few friends coming up from Pennsylvania. They're gonna stay in the new house. We have room for people to stay with us now.
Nice.
If we haven't burned it down or anything by then. But yes, I will be at the game.
Nice.
Apologies in advance. I have never seen Penn State win a game. Not that there's been many examples of that, but I've never seen my team win at Michigan Stadium. I have seen the heartbreak of the 0-2 game, the overtime game. I was there in 2005 when Mario Manningham broke our hearts on the last play. When Penn State won in, I believe it was 2008 there, I was not there. My dad and sister actually went and sat through that rain when Darryl Clark just picked apart Rich Rodriguez's team. It actually might have been 2009, but anyway. Back to the opposition of that game. Michigan is 4-0. They are ranked, I think, 4th in the country, 5th, depending on which poll you look at. But I think we learned a lot more about them in 60 minutes against Maryland on Saturday than we really knew before that. They had played Hawaii, they had played Colorado State, and they had played UConn, who might be 3 of the 5 worst teams in FBS football.
I think those teams have a combined 2 wins.
Colorado State lost to someone on Saturday that I'm not even sure is a real school. It might have been one of these like DeVry sorts of situations. But Michigan,
Larry Fitz finally joined the University of Phoenix football team after all those commercials.
and tore up the Rams of Colorado State. But if not for Blake Corum, then Maryland probably comes away from that game with a win. And credit to Michigan, Blake Corum had an unbelievable day, over 200 yards rushing, a couple touchdowns. But J.J. McCarthy struggled. Maryland was able to move the ball with some ease, and Talia Tagovailoa has been very good. He got banged up late in the game. But if not for 3 Maryland turnovers, one of which was dubious at best, that probably should have been reviewed and overturned, Maryland was right in that game, if not for Blake Corum.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, and you kind of hinted at this, what is Michigan? Do we know yet? They go to Iowa on Saturday, where I think we'll probably learn a lot more about their offense. I don't think we're going to learn anything about their defense, because Iowa's offense is stuck in 1960. But I think
Iowa's offense is their defense.
Yeah, but they have two defensive touchdowns against Rutgers.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
What is Michigan? Obviously they're a talented team. J.J. McCarthy is a good quarterback. Blake Corum is, I think, one of the more underrated players in the country, or at least one of the least discussed really good players in the country. But without Aiden Hutchinson, without David Ajabo, they're not what they were a year ago. But I'm not really sure we know what they are, though.
I don't want to be disrespectful to the reigning Big Ten champs. I have a natural ambivalence, I guess would be the right word, towards Michigan. I think I used that word correctly. College of Com, I'm sorry if I didn't. But I don't think it's easy to replace 2 talented coordinators, Aiden Hutchinson, a first-round pick, and David Ajabo, who would have been a first-round pick had he not gotten hurt in the evaluation process. I don't think you lose those pieces and then run off a double-digit win season very easily. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not going to be like what it was for those first 3 games. And Maryland showed that they do not have that pin your ears back and cause havoc package guys up front that can really force a quarterback who has shown he can get the yips in the past in Sean Clifford to make mistakes. So is Michigan good? Yes. Would I say Penn State's better? I have to say yes. The body of work is just flat out better. I no disrespect to the teams that they've played, but Penn State went on the road and has 2 wins against Power 5 foes. And again, good for Michigan. Ride the high of this Big Ten title as long as you can. And if playing 3 cupcakes gets you there, awesome, good, great for you. But I'm not convinced that they're, a touchdown better than Penn State. I'm not convinced they're a field goal better than Penn State. I'm not sold yet. And I think Iowa's going to go a long way. I think Iowa can pull that upset very realistically. I don't think that's at all out of the question. I think Iowa's better than we thought. I think it's really fun to make fun of them because of what happened in week 1. And they should still be made fun of because that was very funny. But that's not a bad team in Iowa City.
And especially on defense. I think Bill Connelly has them as the number 1 defense in the country. Their offense, I think, is like 115th.
That's still too high.
Yeah, that acknowledges that they have an offense. But I'm looking at Michigan stats here, and it's so hard to figure this out because we really have, I think, 60 minutes to evaluate them on. The teams they played out of the Big Ten are just bad, and not just bad, but among the worst teams in Division I. And that's not, I heard someone locally saying, I was a Michigan State fan, that is on one of the sports talk stations in town, was claiming that Michigan intentionally scheduled this schedule the way they did. These games were set up years in advance.
Yeah, you should.
UConn has been terrible for as long as I can remember now, but Hawaii has been respectful. They certainly have had some great offenses. They've fallen apart in the last couple of years. It wasn't that long ago that I remember Colorado State being one of the better Group of 5 teams. But with that said, they're not good. And I don't think you can take a whole lot of what anyone on Michigan's team did from those games and try and apply it towards what are they going to do this weekend in Iowa. I think they go to Indiana the week before Penn State goes there. If this game was in State College at Beaver Stadium, I think we collectively would have a lot more confidence about Penn State's chances. But the Big House has been a house of horrors for Penn State for since they joined the Big Ten, basically. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about Michigan on Saturday at noon against Iowa.
That
is big noon.
Oh, nice.
I think Michigan catches a little bit of a break. I don't know if Kinnick is as magic at noon as it is at night, but I'm fascinated to watch that game, and I'm glad that Penn State's game against Northwestern is a little bit later because I think not that I'm going to be taking copious notes and film study and things like that, but I'm very curious to see what Michigan's offense does against at this point the best defense in the country according to Bill Connolly's numbers.
Mm-hmm.
When this game was set up as the whiteout against Minnesota the week after Michigan, I think there was a level of disappointment, of course, because we thought the Ohio State game has been the whiteout game for since its inception, basically when Ohio State's been at home, but because of the Fox TV contract, blah blah blah. Now it seems rather fortuitous.
This is cool. I really
and
like
I think
this.
it's different, which is always nice, I think. But I think Minnesota's really good. They have played no one. Like you said, Michigan State has not been able to recapture the magic of a year ago that they had with Kenneth Walker. Their secondary is a mess. But Minnesota went into East Lansing and just absolutely dominated that game. It was something like 350-40 in yardage at halftime. It was 34-7 final. It wasn't that close. Michigan State scored with just a handful of seconds left to get on the board and avoid being shut out. But Minnesota has their own sixth-year senior in Tanner Morgan. They got the band back together. Kirk Shiraka is back coordinating the offense for PJ Fleck. And the last time Penn State played Minnesota, they were upset in Minneapolis, another game I was at. Maybe I should stop going to games. I'll be at the whiteout game as well. And I'm beginning to doubt myself on all this. But I guess my question to you is Minnesota for real? Is Bill Connolly, is S&P Plus right with them at 7th in the country? Is Minnesota that good?
It's hard to tell. It's different than 19. If you remember 19, they were just winning close games. Like the ball would just keep on bouncing their way. This version of Minnesota is trouncing people, like dominating on both sides of the ball. So I think Michigan State is hot garbage. I think they're one of the most overrated teams in college football still. I think that program, I think, is just in a really tough spot and is proving that portal building doesn't work. But that's not to say I don't think Minnesota is really talented. Mo Ibrahim is the best running back in the Big Ten. No doubt about it in my mind. I am dreading that game. So just because of the storyline of if Minnesota wins with Kirk Shiraka, the online discussion about Franklin picking the wrong guy between Shiraka and Yurcich is going to be insufferable. So we will cross that bridge when we get to it. But I think they're good. I'm more convinced they're good, like capital G good, than I am Michigan so far.
It's funny. It's kind of to some degree in their Minnesota and Michigan are kind of in the same boat where their non-conference schedule told us basically nothing.
Rowing it? Oh,
I'm sorry.
Are they both rowing it? It's a stupid joke.
That went right
joke.
over my head. But I'm with you, man. I feel like I know more about Minnesota than I do about Michigan. I don't know if that's because I think Michigan State is more 2021 Michigan State than 2020 or 2022 maybe. But I guess it's just the way they've gone about it. I think Tanner Morgan, I have confidence in him because he's struggled the last couple of years, but I remember what he did in 2019. He's super efficient. He's completing almost over 77% of his passes. Just one interception. He's only been sacked one time. What I'm curious about is Chris Autman-Bell, who was their top receiver, is out for the season.
That's such a bummer.
Absolutely,
such a bummer, man.
From a homer perspective, it's obviously going to benefit Penn State. But I want to see Tanner Morgan in the Minnesota passing game against Penn State's secondary. And I'm fascinated to see this matchup because, and we saw it when Kirk Shiraka was running the Penn State offense. They were going to RPO you to death. And like you said, Mo Ibrahim is one of the best big backs in the Big Ten, if not the best. And so it's a running game you absolutely have to respect. Their offensive line is always solid. But I am fascinated to see how Manny Diaz goes up against that Minnesota offense. I don't know if we know anything about the Minnesota defense because of who they played. Solid, if not, they don't have that NFL caliber star like they had with Winfield a couple years ago.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm just looking at stats kind of here as we're talking, and they've picked off 4 passes. They have a handful of sacks. It's just they're a much more of an unknown. I feel like I know the Minnesota offense is good because it's guys that have done it in the past over a longer body of work. I think Penn State at this point, I feel confident they can probably move the ball. I feel like they can probably run the ball on Minnesota to some degree with Allen and Singleton. Um, but
Hmm.
I am fascinated to see how Penn State handles that RPO attack. And then the elephant in the room, Halloween weekend. We It's not officially a big noon game, but I think we all know it will be. Michigan State is that day, and the rumor around here is that's going to be a night game, which means that Ann Arbor might actually burn to the ground with those two fan bases, with a whole day of tailgating in them. But Ohio State comes to Happy Valley on Halloween weekend. Um, Ohio State looked like what I think we all expected Ohio State to look like against Wisconsin on Saturday. Wisconsin's not good. Wisconsin's, I think a lesser version of what Wisconsin usually is. A physical team up front, a solid defense. But I think Ohio State was just able to out athlete them. That was out without
Yeah.
Jackson Smith and Jigba, who missed. I think that's his third game now that he's missed since getting hurt against Notre Dame. Um, I have no delusions that Ohio State is down or gettable. I think it's at home. Penn State's always played Ohio State close, especially at home with James Franklin. I think Penn State, like you mentioned earlier, Matt, has the secondary to hang with Ohio State's receivers in passing game, but they're just so deep. C.J. Stroud is so good, and Jim Knowles has them playing defense, which has been the case the last couple of years. Um,
Mm.
there's a reason why they're talked about with Georgia and Alabama as kind of, I think, the 3 teams that we know are really good, and that 4th spot in the playoff picture is just anyone's guess at this point. Um, but I guess we're a month out, over a month out. Do you have any thoughts on that game, or are we still, should I be more worried about Minnesota and Michigan at this point?
I think you got to be more worried about the first two on your schedule. You got to get through them. Ohio State's good, and they're national title contender good until they prove me otherwise.
Yeah,
I think they're really
well,
talented.
for sure, and I think we kind of got diluted a little bit from that Notre Dame game. Notre Dame struggles, against losing to Marshall, and then really struggling against Cal. Um, I think I think we allowed what Notre Dame is to influence what Ohio State is to some degree. I mean,
Hmm.
they have just first round talent all over that offense, especially. And I think that's regardless of how good Penn State's defense is, and I think it's really good. That's a scary
Hmm.
proposition. Um, the Big Ten is weird this year. To move on from the Penn
It
State schedule
is.
a little bit. Um, I think we know Ohio State's really good. Like we said earlier, I think Penn State is in that contender status. I think even though we're not sure what Michigan is, I think you have to put them there until they prove us otherwise. I think we know what Minnesota is to some degree. After that, it is Iowa can't score points offensively, but they stop everyone. Um, Purdue
Hmm.
has lost 2 games by, I want to say it's like 6 combined points or something like that. Um, they struggled against FAU, but Aiden O'Connell was hurt. What is the Big Ten? Is it really truly these 3 or 4 teams at the top and then a big gap? Is there someone that you think can kind
Yeah.
of the West is who knows? But there's this really fine line, it feels like, between the top of the conference. If we're going to count teams like Penn State, Michigan, and Minnesota in that kind of contender tier, even though we acknowledge Ohio State is a step above those teams. And then there's this big gap. It doesn't feel like it's been like that before. And
Yeah.
you know, it, someone's going to rise up in there. We're going to have a bunch of teams that are at 7-5 at the end of the year, that just beat up on each other, and the top of the conference beats up on them. I guess through a month of the season, what are your general thoughts on the Big Ten outside of these top teams?
I think we're seeing the power dynamic shift. I think Rutgers is ascending. I said this for the past few years. I'm a big Greg Schiano fan. I think he knows how to win at Rutgers. I think Mike Loxley is a really good coach for Maryland. I think Michigan State Nebraska, and Northwestern are the clear bottom feeders. I think that those powers that, if you even think back this past decade of Big Ten football, I think those were three of the schools you probably would have put in the top half of the programs. And now I think they're the three worst programs in the Big Ten. So I think it's shifting. Wisconsin, I think, is rapidly approaching an inflection point in their program as to what do they want to be. I think Paul Chryst has taken them as far as they can go. I don't know what direction you can take, but it's they're never not going to win more than how do I want to word this? They're never not double negative gonna win more than 10 games. That's just not what they're built to do, and that's not going to be acceptable. So I think we're finding ourselves in a moment where the Big Ten second tier big brands are going through identity crises, and things will begin to shift as the season goes. And I think that's why it feels so weird.
Yeah, and it's yeah, I think you put it well. I think Wisconsin teams like Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, I'm fascinated by, because I think PJ Fleck is the type of coach that can maybe not get them to a Penn State or Michigan, or in recent history Michigan State levels, for example, where you are a true playoff contender, maybe not on the level of an Ohio State or an Alabama or a Georgia, those teams that have competed and won at that level. But can they be good enough to win the Big Ten and get to the playoff and then get your doors blown off by Georgia?
Yes.
I think that's what Wisconsin and Iowa thought they could be with kind of the way they have to build their programs. But I think that gap is widening with the eastern side of the conference, ban the divisions, eliminate them, all those sorts of things. But I think that talent gap and the level of athleticism between the top of the conference and these, the second tier elite programs like Iowa, like Wisconsin, like Nebraska was supposed to be, that gap is growing so much where you're going to see. I mean, we've seen it every year. It seems like in the Big Ten championship game. But when you have these cross division matchups during the season, like we had with Ohio State and Wisconsin, a team that's supposedly one of the favorites in the Big Ten West, and it's not even close. And you saw it when Penn State beat Wisconsin in Indianapolis back in 2016 in the second half, especially when the athleticism just took over. I'm with you. I'm fascinated to see where this goes, especially at a place like Wisconsin that I think has experienced more, we'll say, national success, not playoff level success, but has gone to New Year's 6 games, won those games. How long do they let this happen, where they fall further and further behind the Ohio States? I think if we saw Penn State play them, we saw Michigan roll them last year in Madison in a game that wasn't particularly close. So I think that's a fun subplot. So much of the attention of college football gets directed on the playoff and championships, but I think one of the things that's always intrigued me about college football, at least, has been these secondary storylines. Teams that aren't going to compete for those things, but they have their own goals. That if Northwestern, for example, wins 9 games, that's a huge year for them. They're not going to make national waves in any sense of the word, but those are the things that make the game fun. Maybe they'd upset someone. So I'm fascinated to see kind of how that plays out, especially in the West, because that's where all these teams reside. Does someone like Minnesota?
It's killing the Big Ten nationally, and as we head to this 2-conference system, essentially, they're going to start dragging everybody else down
for sure. And is it a coaching philosophy? Is it a university philosophy? Where football just isn't as critical to the university as it is at a place like Penn State, to be blunt. So again, we could do a whole other podcast. Maybe we'll do that during the bye week instead of talk about the Penn State quarterback situation. But
why not both?
Any other final thoughts before we call it a night, Matt?
That's all I got. Before I forget, Michigan and Minnesota run modern power, which is how to be successful. In 2022, Wisconsin and Iowa refuse to have anything modern, and that's why there's that tier level, despite them playing similar philosophically. So That's all I got.
Spencer Petras
Penn State's
and
4-0.
Graham Mertz might have maybe part of that as well. But
yeah, you're not wrong.
thanks for listening, everyone. We will be back later this week with a look ahead to Northwestern and probably some other fun things. I'm glad to be back. I apologize for the green wall behind me. That is, I swear, not Spartan green. That is, I don't even know what color we picked. But eventually we'll have some golf photos in here and some golf memorabilia that I've collected.
Nice.
That's the purpose of the green is, as I explained it at least. My wife, the Michigan State fan, might have a different story. But good to be back with everyone. I apologize for being absent for the better part of a month while we packed and moved. But looking forward to being with everyone the rest of this way through the last 2/3 of the Penn State season. Thanks for listening. Don't forget Roar Lions Roar at home field to get 15% off. And for Matt Flipovitz, I am Matt DeBear. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Go State.